Hello, this is Christian Idealism. So today I have a different guest. His name is Cam, and he calls himself an atheistic naturalist. Because you're not a theist, you're actually an atheist. So we would have different views on philosophy. But I wanted to come here and kind of dialogue with you about certain topics like philosophy of mind, philosophy of religion, stuff like that. So just tell me, like, before we kind of start, like, what's your perspective? Like, what's your view of reality? What's your,
That's a
sorry.
big question.
Yeah. Like, what do you think
um,
is.
so my background a little bit. So I'm not an expert in any of these subjects that we're about to discuss. I don't have a PhD or an advanced degree in any of it. So take whatever I say with a big grain of salt. Um, so my general position, it's not one of kind of like a dogmatic commitment to any particular ontology. I think it's most plausible that natural reality exhausts causal reality. So that leaves me open to thinking that there might be non-natural things, provided that they're not causal or not part of causal reality. So it's a kind of a position similar to Graham Alpey, but it's also not one that I like particularly go to the mat for either,
Right.
because I'm kind of the position that when we move past the sciences, we find a lot of difficulty in gaining epistemic access to what is true, and it means that we are rather in the realm of sort of honed speculation and comparative analysis of things like explanatory virtues and what coheres with perhaps like our intuitions. And that means that I'm in a position where I don't really take any strong on like position on metaphysics and ontology, but I do have what I think is a more plausible account, which is what I described before.
Okay. Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. Even though I'm a Christian, I don't really like. I'm very open-minded. Like I'm always. I'm not the type of Christian that's going to say that you're the devil if you disagree with me or whatever. So I'm very open-minded toward changing my views on things, and that's I think everybody should be like that. And I have a feeling that, like, for me, I'm very open-minded, but I'm also against other views, which mainly is views that try to make absolute claims about reality. So this includes both religious people and non-religious people, right? So for me, like, I don't like, I respect people like Graham Oppy, for example. What I don't respect is people like Aaron Ra that are very dogmatic about their positions. So when it comes to dogmatism, I'm very much against dogmatism, regardless of whether or not it's religious or non-religious dogmatism. Um, so that's why I kind of have to be careful in how I evaluate my beliefs, because I'm biased as well. We're all biased, right? Um, so, and again, there obviously are also cultural influences that have influenced my beliefs as well. So I have to take that into account. And so again, they just have to be open-minded. And when it comes to epistemology, I'm more of a Bayesian, so I'm sure you're familiar with that, which is basically like all beliefs are probabilistic, right? So I wouldn't be a presuppositionalist that's going to say that we can know for absolute certainty whether God exists or whether he doesn't exist, right? It's always going to be a probable claim, because that's what most claims are. Almost every single belief we have is going to be, probable in nature. There's never really I don't think there's any beliefs I have that I can say that I can know for absolute certainty. Now, there can be certain beliefs that I know are not true. Like, I know that square circles don't exist. I know that Santa Claus doesn't exist, right? So there are certain things that I could be, more against. But when it comes to like whether or not beliefs things are true, it's very hard for me to say, other than my own existence, if I can know whether or not something is true or something is the case. And so yeah, that's kind of my view, and that's why when it comes to applying just knowledge to all fields. Again, I think all fields kind of follow that same route where everything's probabilistic. Science is probabilistic. History is probabilistic. Almost any field of study is going to be probabilistic. And so I don't like to view science as the only way of truth, right? I also view history as a way of knowing about the past. And so there's a lot of different methods one can use to reach truth. And so one is not above the other in any sense. But yeah, what do you think? I mean, what's your position on epistemology in general?
So if I was to adopt the Bayesian perspective you were talking about there, and make a comment about what I see that distinguishes the sciences from some other areas, is the strength or like the magnitude of what Bayesians call a Bayes factor, which is like the ratio of consequent probabilities, that kind of thing. Well, to give a bit more of a layman's description so people can follow along, it's when you have one theory and it predicts some particular data with a particular strength, and then you put that in ratio with another theory or hypothesis that predicts the same data, and you can, by using a ratio, you compare their magnitudes. And so the distinction between like some particular areas like history and perhaps like the hard sciences or the biological sciences is that you can get really large Bayes factors when you have precise models that make precise predictions about what you will observe in particular circumstances. And that's in comparison with plate or like epistemic fields or fields where you have smaller Bayes factors. That is, you have strength of evidence, which is lower. So like the idea here is that within a Bayesian framework, you can, say in physics, have a model that predicts with a very high degree of confidence, that is a high consequent probability, that you will see some particular thing at some particular time given some certain conditions. And this is in contrast with maybe a field like history, where the types of consequent probabilities that you're talking about are not so high in relation to each other. You might have many models that predict the same data with like almost equally explanatory virtues, or prior probabilities would be one way to cash that out. So I do see a distinction between different fields. I think that they can all be modeled within the same Bayesian epistemic framework as you talk about.
Right.
But I wouldn't try to make the claim that they're on a par with one another, because there is this distinction I can draw between them. And the distinction comes, I think, most strongly from that part that I was referring to
from the hard
earlier.
sciences, right?
Well, yeah, from the hard sciences, but the characteristic of the hard sciences is that they actually put forth precise models that give precise predictions. So when they sit in competition with other models that don't give such precise predictions, they tend to fare really well in the Bayesian analysis. So yeah, but I'm in agreement with you that I think that like the sciences, for example, are not like the only way to come to heightened or increased degrees of credence in propositions. In everyday life, like when I, for example, think about just propositions about my own family, or think about propositions about something to do with my work, it's quite clear that I'm not using the methods of science. I'm not making testable predictions and then repeating experiments or data collecting in some formal fashion. I'm not describing my methodology ahead of time, and etc. Right. But instead, like I am, I have a model about the world in my brain, and I have competitive models, and I make judgments between them based upon how much they cohere or fit with the data that I'm observing. And all of that process, in my view, happens for the most part unconsciously, or like it doesn't happen by virtue of like explicit reasoning that we carry out in our like propositionally in our minds. Like we don't, for example, get out pieces of paper and write down our credences and then give Bayes factors and etc.
Well, no.
It just doesn't really work like that. But still, I do think I try in my personal life to have. I do try to model my credences with like the probability theory calculus. But
Okay.
how
Yeah,
much I achieve that. Well, like just a tangential note there is that like folks like Kahneman and Tversky have shown that at least for most reasoners, and I think probably all reasoners, we have certain cognitive biases that demonstrate ways in which we deviate from the probability calculus.
Right. Well, I mean, I would agree with you that are you basically saying that we using Bayes' theorem, we can't, even if you can't mathematically write it out in a piece of paper, you're still using it subconsciously, like in your mind when you're reasoning. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, kind of like
Okay.
the way that I see it is, I think that from probability theory and Bayesian reasoning, you can draw these general sort of principles, and you can follow those because they can become more. They can become an intuitive part of your reasoning. Like maybe I can give an example. Like one sort of principle that comes out of Bayesian reasoning is that, and it's found elsewhere in epistemology too, so I'm not trying to pretend it's unique, but it's this this idea that when you take a theory and you're given some data and it doesn't predict that data very well, that you can make adjustments to your theory to make it so it better fits that data. Some kind of, or a conclusion from Bayesian reasoning is that by doing so, you lower the intrinsic probability of your theory by the addition of this like auxiliary hypothesis. So when you find, for example, that you're making the claim that I see a dragon in my garage, or there's a dragon in my garage, and then somebody walks along and they say, oh, well, I can't see it. And the person says, oh, it's an invisible dragon. And then they say, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll throw some flour up in the air and I'll see if it makes some footprints and makes an outline. Oh, it's an impermeable dragon, etc. So like, or another example about what Bayesian reasoning teaches you is that you want to the hypothesis or theory that best predicts the observation is the one that gets most epistemic weight, or like has the most evidence given for it for that particular observation. Or there are other things as well. But anyway, maybe we should move on to it.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we can both agree with that. And then so when it comes to that, I feel like when it comes to, I mean, obviously religion is definitely
up for me, unfortunately.
Sorry. So religion is very, like people get very like, ooh, I can't talk about that because it'll hurt my feelings or whatever. And I feel like it's best if you want to like figure out which, at least not religion is true per se, but which one's more probable. You kind of have to look at it as a model of certain events or both in history and how the nature of reality works. So like, for example, if we say that naturalism is true, then obviously none of the religious models are going to work because it has something in there that is not in naturalism per se. And then if you have another metaphysical theory like dualism, then maybe it could work, but maybe it's not as good because even though it does grant non-physical minds or disembodied minds, that doesn't mean that therefore any religion is true. It just means that, the probability of them goes a little up. And so for me personally, like I take an idealist position. So I think that, obviously I think Christianity is the most probable, but of course I don't claim to, I don't really say that it's true in the sense of I know it's true. I just say that I think it's the case. I think it's most probably the case. Again, I could be wrong. So I could be very wrong in my beliefs about Christianity. Turns out, Christianity could be false, but then, God still exists, even if it's not, the Christian God per se, right? And so I think people need to be careful. Like when people say that, like when you grant them that a soul exists, they'll say, oh, well, then therefore Christianity is true. It's like, no, that's not a very valid, like you need to make an inference, right? You can't just say God exists and then go from there to say that one particular religion is true, because that is a very big like gap. That's a very long way. So even if you grant the theists that God exists, that's not granting them their God that they want to exist. And so from there, I think you kind of have to go to the historical claims of what they're saying. I mean, what would you agree with that? Like, I think we would agree that like there's a very big gap. I think most Christians don't realize like there's this really huge gap between theism and Christian theism that people seem to not understand that well.
Yeah, I do agree with that. One way of kind of capturing my thoughts on it is that, like, in the same manner in which when we discuss things, for example, the fine-tuning argument, and what we're talking about is how like particular physical models exist within this large space of possible physical models. And the problem is like, what is it that picks out the particular physical model that describes our universe? And therefore like constrains or makes the consequent probability that we would observe life high. So we're not left with this problem where we have something left to be explained. Now, in the same vogue, I think theism has a space of possible theistic models. Now,
Right.
I would conjecture that a difficulty for theism and for theists to face is the preciseness of those models. But like one way of sort of cashing it out is that it's if you think that God is a being that has intentions, then you've opened up the space of possible theistic models to be those the space of possible intentions. And I think that intuitively, when thinking about gods, people really narrow in on a really specific subspace of the theistic model space, which is like the gods that have positive intentions towards humans, or the gods that have intentions that relate to moral properties, or this type of thing. It's hard to get exactly precise with what I'm trying to express, but anyway, I think you get the general point. And so yeah, I do think that like theism is really broad. I think sometimes it's thought to be really narrow, but it's really not. And I think that we get quite a lot of bias from our theistic traditions about what the possible models are. And so when people think about gods, they have a tendency to think about the gods that they were raised with, or the gods that they came into, like the concepts of gods they came into or they encountered during their upbringing, or perhaps even in their adult life. And I do love the fact that people such as yourself are considering much broader theistic models. I like that. I think
right. Even within, like, for example, one of my favorite philosophers, Bernardo Kastrup, he's not a Christian, but he does acknowledge the fact that he has like his own model of God per se. It's like an impersonal being, but he does acknowledge that, like, technically speaking, you could have Christianity could be true even if this God exists, right? I guess we would just have to say that like the universal wave function, or not the universal consciousness, or his God would kind of like personalize itself into a thing, which would be Jesus, right? So again, you could say it's ad hoc, right? You could always say like, oh, that violates Occam's razor. There's no reason to assume that. But again, it does work, right? So that's why for me, I'm more open toward, different ideas of what God is. I don't really have a problem with saying that God is this impersonal force in nature, or I probably would be a Christian if that were the case, but because I have to take into account that yes, the Christian God is a personal deity, right? He does care about humans. So in that sense, I kind of have to grant, just for religious purposes, that God is personal. But again, I don't have to, that's why I have to be very careful, because when I say I'm a Christian, I'm an open-minded Christian, so I have to be open to things like process theology or open theism, or things that have been considered heresies by the church, right? So for me, I don't really care whether or not something is called a heresy. I just care whether or not it's true, whether or not it could be applied toward, my religion or whatever. And I think that's kind of why most people have this very hard time, taking my kind of position on it, because, you've had Christians throughout history that have said, oh, that's heretical, right? You've had councils of church authorities that have said, oh, well, we can't accept this version of God because, it's against this belief or whatever. And to me, I'm just like, who cares? Like, it doesn't matter, you know? So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think that Christians, and not just Christians, but like any religious people, should be more open-minded towards other models of God that don't necessarily fit with how Christians throughout history have modeled God? I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's hard to take a position on what people should do and stuff like that, but I know that my own curiosity has inclined me towards considering many different theistic Christian models. So, like, I guess as an example of this, when I was a Christian, I wasn't a Christian in the way that a lot of people would think. Like, for example, I didn't believe in hell. I couldn't reconcile the idea of a loving creator and the concept of hell, at least the one presented to me as a kid.
Right.
And I also, like, there was many elements of the Gospels that even as a Christian, I didn't think were very likely. And I, yeah, so I mean, I wasn't a very typical Christian even. And by the way, I wasn't a Christian for a very long time. I was raised as a Christian, but like my parents were, they were very loose about it. They sent me to Sunday school with my aunties, and I so imbibed a variety of Christian ideas from my extended family. My grandparents and aunties were highly religious, kind of more the sort of charismatic Pentecostal variety. But my parents weren't, and so in the family home, I didn't really get exposed to it directly from them. I didn't get told what I had to believe. But I converted when I was 16 and then sort of like fell away, like backslidden sort of thing. And then again when I was about 19. And both of those times had only lasted for about a year. So I think a lot of people wouldn't even really consider me a Christian. But I did believe that Jesus was resurrected. So I don't know if that counts for anything.
Well,
and I obviously believed in God. Yeah.
Well, for me, I mean, I feel like there has to be some necessary conditions, right? So, like, to be a Christian, you have to accept that Jesus rose from the dead. You have to accept that God is personal. And then you also, I think, basically the only three things would be you have to accept that Jesus rose from the dead, you have to accept that God is personal, and you have to accept that, Jesus is responsible for your salvation. So I think those three things are kind of the necessary criteria for you to be a Christian. And then the other views, like, your view on hell, or, the exact model of how you think of God, I think could be, it can be somewhat flexible depending on how you do it. But yeah.
Yeah. I I don't know how to define, like, that seems like the essentials to me, but I mean, people have very different opinions on that.
Well, right.
But I'm with you that I do think it's worthwhile. I think people should be curious about other theistic models, and I think that they should be they should follow their own light of reason, so to speak, when dealing with theological problems or problems of, history and what history tells us about the Bible and things like that. So I think people should. I come from like a sort of skeptical, free thinker kind of background a bit. Like when I was about 20, I got into that skeptic scene, and so they're really big on just like considering alternate ideas and obviously using evidence to adjudicate between them. But so I would encourage that, but that's kind of anathema to some forms of Christianity. So I know there's a lot of people that don't really like that idea.
Yeah, I know. Trust me. I mean, I've been researching Catholicism, and there's these things they're called Catholic dogmas, and a lot of them are a set of beliefs that you have to accept as a Catholic, right? So these include like the perpetual virginity of Mary, or that the idea was Mary was sinless, or I think purgatory as well, and then also that the bread and wine are literally the blood of Christ, at least metaphysically speaking. So I don't know. Again, you have to. I've been trying to understand like how that works from a metaphysical perspective, but I guess there's like a Thomistic way how it works.
Couched within, commonly couched within like some Thomistic framework or metaphysics.
So yeah,
and I don't think that they're quite meaning what people think they mean by saying that they are the same. But yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to turn towards the like discussing the Gospels or historical method, and like how you apply Bayesian reasoning to questions of history, or towards like idealism specifically, or quantum mechanics, that type of stuff. Whatever you're up for.
Okay, so I don't actually. We'll start off with the history because that's kind of like. I'm not really big on that. So for me, I actually don't accept the minimal facts. So I just want to make myself clear. I've tried to defend it the best I can, but I can't do it. Even from a Christian, even from someone like me that can be considered biased toward Christianity, I have. It's very hard for me to be honest while also defending the minimal facts. And I think the reason why is you can explain those facts, at least the minimal facts, without implying the resurrection. And it's very simple how you do it. So basically what you do is you say that Jesus was an apocalyptic teacher, right? So that would mean that his predictions about the future, or his prophecy of, because a common argument from Christians when it comes to the historicity of the resurrection, they'll say, "Oh, well, Jesus predicted that he'll rise again from the dead." Well, not really. If you kind of interpret what he's saying in terms of apocalyptic imagery, where because he's an apocalyptic prophet, then he's not predicting his own resurrection. Rather, he's predicting the resurrection of the church itself. So something that happens in the far future. So he's not predicting his death per se. He's predicting the death and the resurrection of the general church in the far future. So, that doesn't really work from a minimal facts perspective. And then when it comes to the empty tomb, you could explain that in terms of the tomb was empty, but someone stole the body, and the reason why they weren't able to find the body was precisely because, well, it was stolen. So that's why the Jews weren't able to grab it and pull it somewhere else. And then I think there's and the crucifixion. Well, that's pretty self-explanatory, but yeah, I mean, I think at least when it comes to minimal facts, I don't like it because it doesn't really make the full case, the best, at least not the best Christian case that one can make. And so for me, I go for a maximal fact approach, which is basically just arguing from New Testament reliability. And I have a book. It's called The Jesus Legend. I don't know if you have it. It's really good. And what it
Is that
does,
by Boyd?
yeah,
E.M.
yeah,
Boyd? Yeah,
yeah.
I've got that.
So that book pretty much is like my fourth runner when it comes to at least general gospel reliability, right? So it's not necessarily arguing for the resurrection per se, but it's arguing basically that the oral traditions behind the gospels are generally reliable, and then from there I present or I hold to a maximal case approach to the resurrection specifically. So that's kind of how I view it from now. What's your perspective on that?
So, yeah, with respect to minimal facts, I mean, it's important to talk about like what minimal facts you're talking about, because like Lycona and Habermas at different points in debates and in books have used different sets of minimal facts, while William Lane Craig states that he doesn't use the minimal facts approach, at least in his debate presentations and in parts of his books. He does use like a limited set of facts. So it's important to talk about like what precisely they are. But in general, what I mean there is that there isn't one set of minimal facts. There has been different sets of minimal facts used by the same authors and in different contexts. So for example, you mentioned the empty tomb, but my understanding is that currently Gary Habermas doesn't actually use that as one of his minimal facts in his modern presentation
today.
The argument, because my understanding is that he has shifted somewhat in his analysis of what percentage of scholars accept the empty tomb. It's good to talk about the criteria that Habermas uses for
very strict criteria.
Something.
So I grant, it's a pretty good criteria. It's pretty strict, very strict, but yeah, I understand what you're saying. Definitely the empty tomb it doesn't meet the same criteria as the other facts. So
yeah, well, I mean, on that one in particular, like there is a lot of confusion, I think, publicly about what the claim is specifically about the scholarly community. You've heard, for example, probably that 75% of published scholars on the term accept.
For me, I don't really like to use that argument because, again, if I'm trying to be honest, that doesn't really sample all scholars in the field, right? So the actual number of scholars that accept it, we don't really know. That's kind of what I think. We have no idea. So
right, and why I was trying to make that point because that isn't even the claim that Gary Habermas makes, and I'll see if I can get it correct. The claim is actually that 70 to 75% of those who have published either positively or negatively accept one or more of a set of arguments positively in favor of an empty tomb. So the claim is actually very nuanced, and it's not what I think most people glean from the presentation you see usually about it. And obviously, like when you start getting into the specifics of that, you can see the methodological problems that it has, because it excludes those people who think that our available evidence doesn't tell us one way or the other.
So it excludes people that are neutral on the position, basically.
That's right, and it's also sampling from a set of literature we think we have a pretty reasonable case to be made would have a sampling bias or a selection bias. The other aspect is that Gary Habermas's 70 to 75% includes non-expert scholars as well. It's actually writers who have published either positively or negatively on the subject. So it includes non-historians like Richard Swinburne, for example.
Oh, okay. Now
Which
that
is
makes
something
sense.
that a lot of people don't realize. And part of the difficulty with this is that Gary Habermas hasn't actually published the sources that he draws the statistics from. But more broadly, like you point out with the comment on maximal facts, like I do think that it's invalid epistemically to consider a limited set of information in analysis of hypotheses. So I think that, like, an epistemic norm that I adhere to is that all information bearing on a hypothesis needs to be incorporated in the analysis. So I don't think that we can restrict ourselves to a minimal set or a limited set
Right, because we
of
don't
facts.
right, because we don't really do that in other fields. If you think about it, like we don't, when we're trying to come up with the best explanation, we don't just use only, minimal facts, right? We try to encompass all the facts, right? So I think that's why maximal facts is
Yeah, and
definitely much better. So
an example of this, which I think helps to reveal how, at least in the published literature by Licona, Habermas, and Craig, the account of what constitutes the best explanation of even the minimal facts suggested. The ascension is an example. So if we consider one more minimal fact to be added, it's that out of both theistic and non-theistic, Christian and non-Christian scholars, almost everybody agrees that around a month after Jesus' death, he was absent bodily on earth and inactive bodily on earth. So the reason there's a variety of reasons why people think this, but generally the argument is that we have a lot of data in Acts and a lot of data in the Pauline epistles that suggest that around a month after Jesus' crucifixion, he wasn't alive and bodily active on earth. Now, the way in which this is explained is actually different on different people's claims about history. So for the non-Christian historians, they think that this is explained by the fact that Jesus died and remained dead.
right,
And it's a generalization from our understanding of biology, that when people die, they're not alive bodily on Earth.
right,
Subsequent to that.
right. That
It's
makes
pretty
sense.
obvious. It feels like
Right,
it doesn't really need pointing out. But like on the more sort of Christian end of the hypothesis space, it's usually thought that Jesus, from the account of Acts 1 verse 9 and also I think Luke 24, that Jesus ascended in some fashion, however that exactly happened, to heaven. So he went up and it was observed by some disciples that he ascended to some place up in the sky, or maybe that was
right,
metaphorical or something like that, I don't know. But the point here is that there are the minimal resurrection hypothesis, that is the one that makes the claim that Jesus after death arose
right,
bodily on earth, doesn't actually make the prediction that Jesus would fly up to heaven. It's compatible with Jesus walking around and remaining on earth and continuing to teach people, or bringing about a powerful kingdom on earth direct in the physical presence after his resurrection. It's compatible with many different. It's compatible with the claim that he went off to the United States and
right,
talked to some people. It's compatible with many different things, and so at least the minimal resurrection hypothesis has to be put in conjunction with the claim that Jesus, after his death, around 30 days later, ascended into heaven or disappeared physically from earth in such a way that he wasn't alive and bodily active. So that's like one way in which I think like the minimal facts case doesn't quite do
right, because there's more that
the
needs to be
thing that's
explained.
needed. But
Basically, is that so? Basically,
yeah,
there needs to be more of an explanation rather than just the resurrection, right? Is that what you're saying?
yeah, I think
Okay,
there's minimal facts that,
right.
so
Okay,
like if we adopt the paradigm of Habermas, then I think that there are other minimal facts that he doesn't include that are agreed upon by all historians, that the resurrection hypothesis alone, without being conjoined to an ascension hypothesis, doesn't explain. And so
okay,
it actually affects our in two fashions. It affects our account of the explanatory virtues of the hypothesis. One, it affects the explanatory scope and power of the hypothesis because it's been observed that there is data that the resurrection hypothesis doesn't explain. That is, where's Jesus? Where was Jesus
right,
after a month after his
right.
resurrection? And then it also is affected in its ad hocness because, and this is a trade off, by the way, because if you adopt the ascension hypothesis in conjunction with the claim that Jesus resurrected, then you are lowering the intrinsic plausibility or probability of the theory because now you have two claims, one that Jesus ascended and the other that Jesus resurrected.
Okay. Well, I mean, when it comes to ascension, I guess the evidence for that would just simply just be the eyewitness accounts, which again you can kind of argue against. But I mean, I guess you could. I mean, speaking from the Christian perspective, I guess you could say, even if not taking into account prior probability, but just the historical evidence, just say like, oh, there were eyewitnesses that saw Jesus ascend. So I guess you could. That would kind of. So you basically have to adopt both of them because it seems like the evidence would support both theories. At least that's what I would think.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of like blending two different approaches,
Right,
but
right,
yeah, because that's obviously not something that's agreed upon by a consensus of historians. Um,
right.
and maybe this is a good turning point that maybe you and I could talk about what our positions are on the gospel and Acts literature. So, are you of the well, first of all, maybe a good place to start is the literary relationships between the Gospels. So, take for example the Synoptics and John. Um, what is your position on the Synoptic problem?
I think Mark was most likely first, though. I mean, there are some papers that argue against that. So, but I think it's at least right now it seems to be the case that Mark was first, and then later oral traditions kind of formed the other gospels like Matthew, Luke, and John. So again, I think it was mostly. I think my basic, because I mean this also gets into like the genre of the gospels, right? So for me, I take it all as just basically the genre of the gospels is basically all oral traditions, like pretty much all of it. It was only until later that you actually get it written down in the text, and then later on, in church history, they put it all together. But that's kind of my view, where the oral traditions always existed in sort of a linear fashion, and then you have Mark that was written first, and then you have the other gospels, the other synoptic gospels that was written later. Because I don't like to view it in terms of how we would view documents, where because I mean in our culture we live in a what's called a text oriented culture, right? So what we do, we can we can copy from one book and then write in the other book. I don't think that's what really was going on at the time. I think that each gospel writer had sort of their own perspective, and then they wrote their own, oral tradition, so to speak. And then sometimes they overlapped, and sometimes like there could even be, legit contradictions, right? So that could also occur where there are legit, actual contradictions that can't be resolved, but that doesn't really affect the reliability because, well, if there's contradictions, well, that just shows me at least that there seems to be, oral traditions that were consistent and that each one was kind of independently confirmed. That's kind of my view. But yeah, I mean, if you don't necessarily agree with that, I mean, you can let me know what your thoughts are on that.
So I don't have a lot of oral tradition playing a part in my modeling of how the gospel literature was produced. I think that the arguments of Thomas Brodie, for example, and Dijkstra are fairly convincing of the less need for oral tradition, but that's a very broad thing. I'd rather get specific and talk about the way in which oral tradition is acting as an explanatory hypothesis for specific data we find within the Gospels. So let's take an example. When we observe verbatim agreements between Matthew and Mark, or Luke and Mark, how is the oral tradition hypothesis expecting that data versus how is a literary hypothesis, including the use of an underlying source, explaining it? And my conjecture to you is that in that question, that is verbatim agreements and redactional, verbatim plus redactional agreements, I think that the literary hypothesis, where one author has access to and is using another source, is a better explanation of the data that we find. Whereas an oral hypothesis requires us to assume an unmotivated, ad hoc hypothesis involving a controlled process of transmission, utilizing oral transmission practices we don't have an evidence for any of the New Testament authors. And what I mean here is that there is no independent information that gives us evidence that the sources that the gospel authors used were following these highly precise, highly controlled oral practices. And if you want to see an analysis of that, I would suggest reading Bart Ehrman's, or at least a partial analysis of that. I would suggest reading Bart Ehrman's Jesus Before the Gospels, because I think that gets into a really good discussion about what oral hypotheses can explain, what type of expectations we can draw from them, and therefore the way in which the relationships between the synoptics are not adequately explained.
Okay, so would your alternative hypothesis be that it was redacted? It was basically redacted criticism. Is that what you said, or was it something similar?
Yeah, I think that the authors of the Gospel, Matthew and Luke, had access to and were utilizing, either by memory or direct access during the process of composition, a version of the Gospel of Mark. It might not be precisely what our version is, because there is quite a lot of possibility for interpolation and changes, but it's definitely something that allows for the verbatim agreements, as well as deliberate redactional differences that, when taken as a whole and considered in conjunction, allow us to formulate redactional profile hypotheses. If another book worth reading, if you're into this stuff, is Mark Goodacre's The Case Against Q. And regardless about whether or not you
Yeah.
think that Q existed, his chapter 2, I think it is, where he gives an argument for the priority of Mark. He does this by use of a concept called redactional or editorial fatigue, where it's a known phenomena in our background knowledge that when utilizing underlying sources, an author will make an effort to make changes to that source that over time during the process of compositional redaction or copying will carry lowered fidelity to changes. So the idea here is that, like, I take a story, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that story, but I'm going to make my own changes to it. And what we observe, at least with the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, is that there are occasions where data we have is best explained by the hypothesis that the redactor, Matthew or Luke, is taking Mark as an underlying source and is trying to make changes to it, and then failing to keep consistent with those changes as the story goes on in a fashion that resembles like fatigue. And when I say fatigue, I mean like that in the process of copying, you get effectively cognitively tired, or you sort of lose a thread of emendation you were trying to carry out. There's a couple of examples of this. One of them that Goodacre describes in chapter 2 is during the redaction of the account of Herod the Great. Herod and John the Baptist. The author makes changes about the disposition that Herod had towards John that he fails to carry out in the course of his redaction. Another example is in Luke's this is a slightly different example, but in Luke's rewriting of the parable of the talents, he fails to carry out some of the redactional changes he wants to make through to the end of the story, and ends up having Matthean content bleed into his story toward the end. But I mean, this is really just merely to say that I think that there's a variety of data that is less adequately explained by oral hypotheses and better explained by literary hypotheses.
So literary, again, you're talking about redaction, right? Because I just want to...
Yeah, redaction, okay. Yeah. Okay. But I mean, I think that there's also a lot of content in the Gospel of Mark that's best explained by
because
literary hypotheses purely as well. But
yeah, because like I said in the beginning, I'm not as well read on like New Testament reliability as my other stuff I study. So because the stuff I study is all philosophy of mind, at least most of it. So you can send me the link to, I'll read it and I'll check out those books. Though we'll see, because this pandemic, I'm gonna, hopefully my job will give me enough money so I can get that material. But yeah, I'll check it out. I mean, for redaction criticism, again, I would go back to the book I recommended earlier, which is The Jesus Legend, and I think it's around page 400 that they briefly talk about redaction criticism and all that stuff. So, and again, they're arguing for the oral hypotheses, because they're mostly arguing against redaction criticism in the book. So you can check that out if you want, but yeah, I mean, I'll definitely check out.
Don't get me wrong. I do think that there are oral sources underlying parts of the Gospels. It's just more this idea that the literary relationships between the Gospels can be explained by oral hypotheses. That's the part that I would reject.
Okay.
But it's not that there are no oral processes involved. It's just that, to me, the evidence is clear and unambiguous that the authors regardless of what type of oral sources they had available to them, were using the Gospels as like actual literary works. And yeah, but yeah, we can get into that perhaps in another discussion.
Yeah. And I don't know if you got this book. And again, it's not even biased toward any of you particularly. It's called Jesus, Skepticism, and the Problem of History. Have you gotten that book, or because this is pretty new?
No, I don't. I don't even know who that's by.
It's actually written by a lot of authors, and there's like multiple essays from multiple different people that talk about like the new updated stuff. I have to reread it because it's been like a year since I read it, but
any like articles in there that you would recommend in particular?
No, probably the one we were just talking about. Hold on, let me try to find it. I know Boyd, he wrote a chapter on oral New Testament reliability, or at least oral traditions, like we were discussing. Hold on, let me see which chapter it was. It's somewhere in here.
Wait, here's a question for you. Do you think that there are oral traditions underlying the infancy narratives in the Gospel of Matthew?
Infancy, like, oh, you mean
or the birth narratives?
I don't know. I'll have to look into that. Not that I don't that specifically. I don't know. I think it's more likely yes, but I could be wrong. So that's what I think. But yeah, I'll have to, because I'm planning. If I could if as long as I don't deconvert, I might do a video series on that, on New Testament reliability. But we'll see. It's going to take a while, a lot of research. So, if I turn out to be wrong, then got to be wrong. But yeah, that specifically, I don't really know for sure.
Yeah, I'm maybe how much longer do you want to go for? I'm probably available for another 15 minutes or 20 minutes.
Okay, yeah, let's just briefly talk about quantum mechanics, because I know that's what you kind of wanted to discuss with me about a week ago. So what is your, I guess we can discuss interpretations, because I have my view on it is I don't necessarily see all interpretations as competing against each other. I think there are certain aspects of interpretations that kind of overlap with each other. So what's your position on interpretations? Do you think that they're all completely competitive against each other, or do you think that some of them can kind of overlap and one explains the other, or whatever? What do you think?
There are quite a lot of interpretations. So, I do think that most of the ones that are worth considering are competitive with each other. So, as an example, like the Giraldi, Weber-Rimini, the GRW hypothesis actually puts forward an altered mathematical model for reality that involves spontaneous collapse. The Bohmian mechanics or de Broglie-Bohm theory involves an additional piece of mathematical machinery to pick out the real trajectories.
Right.
The objective collapse, or like the measurement postulate style Copenhagen, involves what I see as some like non-unitary postulate.
Yeah, which I don't.
So I do think that they are competing. Maybe not all of them are competing with one another, but to some degree or another, they take different positions ontologically with respect to the wave function, and they either add in or don't add in additional laws in combination with our sort of usual Schrodinger or Dirac picture.
Right. Yeah, I've kind of viewed, so I break it up into like, I think 3 or 4 classes. So you have hidden variable theories, which is Bohemian mechanics. I wouldn't say that GRW is considered a hidden variable, though it still postulates something that isn't directly found within, the Schrodinger equation. It's kind of like this extra force of nature, so to speak. So, you have the extra forces of nature, hidden variables, GRW, it's one class. And then you have operational interpretations, which is Copenhagen, what's the other one? The ensemble interpretation, though I don't know any physicist that actually holds to the ensemble. I think that's just an older version of Copenhagen. So you got that, which basically treats quantum mechanics, just pure pragmatically. And then you have what's called the relational interpretations, which can include, just the standard relational interpretation of Ravli. I can't pronounce his name. And then you also have, yeah. And then you also have the consciousness causes collapse view, which that doesn't have to be relativistic, though. To me, I think it does have to be relativistic. So you got that. And then you also have another class of interpretations, which is the many worlds, which I kind of place that under its own camp because it doesn't really, it's unitary as well. So you got to take that into account as well. So my stance is basically that any interpretation that is not unitary, I think has a lot of problems because it violates what's called the conservation of energy, but not just classical information, but also quantum information. So the collapse of the wave function under non-relativistic quantum mechanics would basically destroy quantum information, which I think is non-unitary. So that would include, Copenhagen, the interpretation that inspiring philosophy proposes, that would also be non-unitary. So I don't accept his view. I kind of modify it a little bit. And then obviously, I don't know any others that would violate it because but I think that's pretty much it as far as non-unitary ones. And then unitary would be, many worlds is unitary, relativistic is unitary, and Bohemian mechanics is also unitary. So I would be more friendly, or I accept the unitary interpretations over and against the non-unitary interpretations. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that in order for an interpretation to be more probable, it has to have unitary in it, or do you think it doesn't really matter?
It's not really how I cash out the evaluation of it. I think, well, the Schrodinger picture, or the direct picture, it's the formalism is a unitary theory. It has this property where like you can go from one state in the present or the past or whatever, like one indexical state to a future indexical state, and you can go backwards. And it's in that sense, like there isn't like a loss of information. You can, but the difficulty is that that's like manifestly not what we observe in our everyday experience. Like the Schrodinger picture describes these evolving macroscopic superpositions that include measurement devices and humans and cats and all sorts of different things in macroscopic distinct superpositions with one another. And it's quite clear that like if we are to like imagine that that's what we experience, that's not correct. Like we don't see the Geiger counter both clicking, or hear the Geiger counter both clicking and not clicking at the same time, or we don't see when we observe like some kind of radioactive piece of material in a cloud chamber, we don't see like a spherical wave coming out of it. Or like another example was the Schrodinger's cat. We don't see it being alive and dead at the same time. So there's like definitely something about that picture that we need to understand further about, like how it is it's meant to explain our everyday experience, our observations. Now,
Right.
I think that there has been good progress starting with Everett,
Oh yeah, I
heading
agree with
on
you.
to into modern foundations of quantum mechanics with people like David Deutsch and David Wallace and um, Sean Carroll and Max Tegmark and folks like that. I do think that there has been some progress in combination with decoherence theory to explain why it is that we wouldn't expect, if it were the case that the Schrodinger picture was right, that we would observe the cat being alive and dead at the same time, like some kind of blurry phenomena, or
Right.
or like.
Hmm.
So I think that like we've made some really good ground phenomenologically within the theory to within, that is, the unitary formalism of explaining like how, despite there being described these macroscopic superpositions, this can be mapped on and accounted for in our experience. And so, as like a conservative kind of person who doesn't really want to go too far beyond the physics, I think that like our best strategy at the moment is to continue on within the the version of quantum mechanics that has been confirmed by repeated experiment and observation. We should continue attempting to understand how this maps on to the manifest image, or like the world of everyday experiences. And I think that progress is good, but there's still a lot of like open problems. So, for example, David Deutsch made some pretty good strides toward recovering the Born rule from within a form of decision theory, theoretic approaches. Max Tegmark has made some good progress towards recovering the Born rule. Sorry, the idea for people not following is that Max Born noticed that like the observational outcomes conform to the mod squared of the amplitude. So in the Schrodinger equation, or like, so if we take like a Dirac picture and we talk about there are these things trying to describe.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a concept of an amplitude, and it's this number. It's a complex number that's associated with particular uh, uh, eigenvectors of an operator. And you, in order to get like statistics about what you're going to observe in a particular measurement, you take like the inner product of that, or you take like the mod squared amplitude of the amplitude, and from that you can get a probability that you'll observe that outcome. And that Born rule, which has been the heart and soul of making predictions from quantum mechanics, is something that's in addition to the underlying wave function picture. So it's like this additional measurement postulate, or it's this thing that you add on to the theory
Right.
to make predictions about what you'll observe in experiments. And it's very tightly connected with this idea that like the types of operators that represent observables are these things called Hermitian operators. And the property of them is that like they have all of the eigenvector of, anyway, let's not get into that. But
No, yeah, yeah.
the the key takeaway is that with people who have been continuing on with the Everettian paradigm, they have made progress towards recovering how probabilities manifest within quantum mechanics from a principled approach, so without trying to add anything additional to the ontology of the theory. And then there's
Right.
also been progress made on what people call the preferred basis problem, or the ontology problem too. And you can read about that in David Wallace's
Well, yeah,
work.
because typically the two biggest objections to many worlds is the many world, or not many. Well, yeah, the biggest objections is the born rule problem and then the preferred basis problem. And typically, I think the best way to solve those two problems is to, for me, I don't treat many worlds like as like these parallel universes that all exist, like 100% certainty it exists somewhere out there, right? Because that's typically the science fiction-y way of thinking about many worlds. For me, I think of it in terms of, just quantum information existing in reality. So the Born rule is basically, just a certain like representation of a certain like branches going off in the wave function, but again, those branches are not other worlds, so to speak. They all exist in the same world. It's just the quantum information that we're using to describe the many worlds is still the same, even though technically speaking they're not, they don't exist as parallel universes. So I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think that we should think of many worlds not as parallel universes, but rather just this quantum information that kind of evolves in their own branches, so to speak?
I take Wallace's approach. So I think that there's a good case to be made that if you allow for the same kind of observation that tigers don't appear in the fundamental description of particle physics, but yet they are an emergent phenomena of the goings-on and the structural relationships within particle physics, then equally you don't need the branches and the sort of isolated or orthogonal worlds that come out of the Schrodinger dynamics. You don't need to see those as being put into the theory from the beginning or appearing as terms in the theory. Instead, like, you see them as structural consequences that come out of the underlying dynamics in the same way that tigers do. So I don't know if I've made that really clear, but the idea is that, like, tables and chairs, they don't come into our underlying physical theory about the world. They are some type of structural emergent byproduct of the operating of the laws of physics that involve, like, wave functions being in certain states and having particular relationships.
Right.
And so I don't see us needing to have worlds put into the theory from the beginning. I think it's okay to, like, recognize that if this state were to undergo Schrodinger dynamics and it was to, continue to evolve and interact with other things such that it undergoes, like, this decoherence process where we end up having two branches that are non-interacting. I think that because of the fact that this underlying quantum information, that's the way that you put it, because of the fact that it has these structural relationships that resemble tigers, and those structural relationships exist and resemble tigers in both of these orthogonal branches that have developed, I think that, like, we are really forced to say that, okay, well, there's a tiger in that part and a tiger in that part too. So and I mean, if you want to scale it down, there's a particular Geiger counter in that part of the wave function and a Geiger counter in that part of the wave function, one of which is clicked and the other which is not clicked, in the case of, some radioactive material.
Right.
So my position is that, like, if within this, quantum information that you talk about, you can find the structural relationships that we think it's valid to call a tiger or a Geiger counter, then it's not it just follows by implication that those things would be tigers and Geiger counters, and there's nothing that like picks out any one as being more real than the other, except for the fact that we find ourselves having the observation of one versus the other.
Right. That sounds very similar to my kind of position, where it's only the perception, where it's only in our perceptions where we get a sense of a defined physical state. But then outside that perception, it doesn't really. It's kind of like in a superposition of possible states, or it could be in these branches, so to speak. So I kind of what I do is I combine relativistic quantum mechanics with many worlds, and I basically say that it's only in our perceptions from our reference frame that we experience a well-defined world. But then once it's outside our perceptions, it's kind of like it exists as not as defined states, but rather this quantum probability, quantum information that exists kind of out there, so to speak.
Yeah. See, I don't take that position, but I mean, this is all speculative anyway, but
right.
I don't take that position because the problem with it, in my view at least, is that there is in that other part of the wave function also a Kyle that has the distinct experience of the other observation. So, for example, if you have a Geiger counter and we're talking about whether or not it clicks or does not click, like within the description of the world, if you accept it as, if you accept something like, wave function realism, or you think that like what we're describing is something real, then it follows by implication of the theory that there is a version of Kyle that sees distinctly the other experience. That's part of the problem.
Well, it's all relativistic, right? So that's kind of how I think.
I mean, the relativity part doesn't add anything or take away anything. Like it doesn't have really any relevance there in my view. It's not changing any of the underlying observations. It's still the case within relativistic quantum mechanics that there is described within the branches of the wave function a Kyle that observes one outcome and a Kyle that observes the other outcome. Now, when you go and look at the Geiger counter, you obviously only have a distinct experience of one of those outcomes. But still, within the formalism, there is a version of Kyle that sees the distinct version of the other outcome. So I don't really see why, except on pain of ad hocness or on pain of sort of like special pleading, that we would see one as being real more than the other one. But I also completely admit that all this stuff is kind of crazy. Like the difficulty is that, and here's something that I would really discourage you in. I don't use quantum mechanics as a means to formulate grand metaphysical ideas. I don't use it as a means to support atheism or naturalism or something like this. I don't use it as a premise in an argument against other people's positions, unless it's some discussion about quantum mechanics itself. And because I recognize, unlike maybe Michael Jones, I don't want to speak for him, but I recognize that this is quite clearly an area where the people who are best placed to evaluate these positions, that is both the philosophers of physics and those who are in physics working in foundations of quantum mechanics, these people really disagree with one another. There is a lot of disagreement in the field. There are people who take many different positions and see it different ways by their lights. And they are having an ongoing discussion at the moment about what are the implications of quantum mechanics. And given that I'm a layman, that yes, I know some quantum mechanics. Yes, I took some quantum mechanics at university and I have a better grasp than most laymen. I'm not an expert. And neither are you, and I know that you don't claim to be,
No,
and
no.
neither is Michael. And so I really think that we need to be humble about this field. And my worry, and I think this is a worry that I share with people like Alan Aldridge, is that when you make your theism dependent on a particular but highly controversial version or interpretation of quantum mechanics, you're putting your theism in a pretty difficult position, because the well, to begin with, it's all really what I just described. You're not an expert in the subject, and you're evaluating it as a non-expert. At best, your position could be described, and when I say yours, I guess I probably have Michael in mind more than anybody, described as taking some particular views that are not consensus or not shared even by a majority of experts, and making that a central premise in an argument for a god.
Right. We don't use theists don't typically use their arguments based on one area of research. So, we don't make it dependent on just one interpretation of quantum mechanics. I just want to make that point clear. We don't have to do that. Like, there's other views we can
definitely don't think you do.
Right.
Yeah, I definitely don't think you have to. And in fact, I would discourage it, because I think that it's like, I kind of think it's an abuse of physics, really. I mean, maybe that's uncharitable.
Well, yeah, there are a lot of abuses of physics. Like, I think I private messaged you about this, how just because consciousness causes collapse, or just because we think it does, that doesn't mean that therefore we can control reality or do magic, right? So there needs to be.
That's the other thing, is that consciousness doesn't cause collapse. Like, that's just like almost. There are very, very few people working in foundations of physics who think that consciousness causes collapse. Consciousness is. It's definitely the case that, like, human brains are large macroscopic objects with large numbers of microscopic degrees of freedom, and so they are the exact type of thermal objects that you expect decoherence to occur with. Like, you can't keep the coherence of quantum superpositions with when interacting with a large macroscopic object. I mean, there's been calculations done that, like, the human eye, as an example, within an incredibly short amount of time, decoherence will occur upon interaction with the human eye. So it's like, yeah, that's clear. Everybody agrees with that. But the same is also true with, like, Geiger counters and other big, large thermal objects.
Well, that's why. Well, that's exactly why I take a more relativistic approach to the whole thing, where, yes, consciousness does collapse the wave function, but only from your reference frame. So, obviously something that's non-conscious can also cause collapse. But when I say that consciousness causes collapse...
But then what's the point in saying consciousness causes collapse? Because in that case, there are in general relativity, like, there's a reference frame for everything. Like, so it's not, I know,
right?
Like, that's reference frames. So it sort of doesn't really add anything, and to me, it just sort of leads people into this, like, old idea of, like, these presentations of double slit experiments, where one says that it's only if a conscious observer looks at the electron going through one slit over the other that collapse occurs.
What do you think about? Well, what about? I'm sure you're aware of this, called von Neumann chains. So that's typically the argument that IP makes, which is that the reason why decoherence does not fully explain wave function collapse is because it still needs, like, if one particle collapses another, then you need something to cause that particle to collapse, and so on and so on. So what would be kind of your response to the von Neumann chain type of argument?
Well, so I'm if I'm to take what I see to be the most plausible version of quantum mechanics, which, as I've obviously
Right,
described,
many
I
worlds,
think
right?
is pretty controversial within philosophy of physics. I think that there's a universal wave function. So there is really just like a unified wave function in Hilbert space that's undergoing Schrodinger dynamics. So this problem is like it's effectively like a non-problem. Like all of these branches that are going on within the wave function are all occurring within a global wave function. So it's really just like a misunderstanding of the view to think that there's an issue here. But I think that things like Wigner's friend, thought experiments like that, and efforts that have been done to perform analogies of this, I think show that there are inconsistencies in viewing there being objective conscious experiencing of individuals and maintaining that like reality is a unity, effectively, like that there's a single description of what is going on that's valid. I think it's the case that from one perspective, in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that in the consciousness causes collapse view, I think that it leads to a form of like inconsistency, where you are forced to maintain that, you're forced to give an explanation about which consciousness is collapsing effectively.
Well, right. No, yeah, that's why I take a relativistic approach, which is where one conscious agent will collapse the reference frame, and then of course there could be hierarchies of conscious agents, right? So that's kind of what Donald Hoffman gets into, where you basically have these conscious agents on top of each other, where I guess he describes it where a system of two conscious agents can constitute one single conscious agent, but then that single conscious agent is still distinct, right? So you have these different conscious agents that will collapse wave functions from their reference frames until you eventually, he's not a theist, by the way, but you kind of get the point where you have this system of interacting conscious agents that will kind of explain quantum mechanics in that sort of way. So that's kind of the view that he kind of proposes, but yeah.
I mean, I think that all of these problems manifest without talking about consciousness at all, but just talking about thermal sort of macroscopic states. I think that all of these underlying problems discussing consciousness can be just redescribed using thermal macroscopic states, and it's all the same evaluation that comes out. I mean, ultimately, I think that what occurs is that there isn't a collapsing of the wave function other than it just being some kind of subjective phenomena that when we interact with things, we can only observe, eigenvalues of these eigenfunctions or eigenvectors.
Right.
So I think that like it's the case that if you take the Schrodinger picture seriously and you take a conservative model towards it, it isn't the case that there is some particular thing that picks out which one you observe over another. Like it's just merely the case that there is this evolving branching structure of the wave function. And so there's not really any problem to be had here. It's like, I think that the problems to be had are for maybe like hidden variables folks. Actually, this is sort of a digression, but this goes back to like another like issue that I have with IP in particular, is that I don't actually think he understands the like Bell's theorem. I don't think he understands the Cauchy-Specker theorem. Cauchy-Specker, because he seems to think that these are let's frame it a different way. He doesn't appear to be aware of the premises that go into the derivation of the theorems that mean that they don't really have a relevance in a discussion of many worlds. So, for example, when you watch IP's video on the many worlds interpretation, it's almost like he's kind of arguing against hidden variable theories, because he's using like the Chaos theorem and Bell's theorem, but without realizing that they contain underlying assumptions that, in particular, about the distinct outcomes, singular outcomes of experiments that are in contradiction with Everettian quantum mechanics. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't. I guess you could, because here's the thing: I don't really have necessarily a problem with many worlds. I only apply it to quantum information, right? That's kind of what I said earlier. But when it comes to like macroscopic states, like you said earlier, then why is there no equation for collapse if that can fully explain collapse? Like there isn't, like we kind of,
Say that again.
No, like what I'm saying is, if the environment can fully explain collapse, like you state, then why is there no collapse equation? Like, why is there not an equation we can use to say, okay, this is the defined state, and this is what explains collapse. We don't need consciousness because we have this equation that can describe it, and we don't need consciousness because the full system is collapsed, so to speak.
So perhaps, like, maybe we could talk a little bit more about decoherence, because in the Schrödinger picture with like unitary dynamics, what you find is, like, say if you have like a superposition, right? You have an electron that's spin up and an electron that's in a superposition of spin up and spin down,
right?
And then you put it through like a Stern-Gerlach experiment, or like something that allows you to get measurable information about or distinct experimental outcomes, depending or sensitive toward which superposition direction it's in. Spin direction.
Spin, yeah.
So in this scenario, the Schrödinger picture describes this, like, these two sort of like parallel streams of goings on that evolve, one in which, and they become orthogonal with one another, one in which the measurement device sees spin up, and one in which the measurement device sees spin down. So, like, when you're asking the question about, like, well, why isn't there like an equation that like explains the collapse or something like that, my answer is merely to say, well, there is. Like, it's just that you're, like, one is imagining that by collapse, what you're thinking about is one of those outcomes being the real one, or the distinctly real one, or something like that. But that's the part that I just don't really think is follows from basically the logic. So I don't think that there is an equation that distinguishes which one is real or which one you will subjectively experience. I think that the Schrödinger picture, or like the Everett picture, or whatever you want to call it, like it literally tells you that there will be a version of you that sees it this way, and there will be a version of you that sees it this way. Okay. So when you're trying to like ask a question about like why collapse or something like that, well, I mean, the solution's just staring at you in the face.
Well, I mean,
it's not really.
Well, yeah, because I mean, obviously, if you take the many worlds approach, then that would kind of be your answer. Well, there is no collapse. Well, technically, there is no collapse, right? Because it all branches into, multiple worlds.
There is collapse. It's just that it's a different thing than what people thought it was. I mean, decoherence theory effectively explains what collapse is. It's like these macroscopic degrees of freedom becoming entangled with the superposition, right? And then it just sort of causes the unitary evolution of the Schrödinger equation just causes there to be these distinct macroscopic goings on.
So let me try to rephrase it. So let's assume that many worlds is not true. How do you explain collapse? How do you explain how microscopic things, assuming that many worlds is not true, can fully explain collapse without some sort of defined state, like consciousness, for example? Like, how do you do that?
I mean, yeah, that's a measurement problem. I honestly don't know. Like, I don't see. I mean, I think that like GRW is like interesting. Like this idea that there is some objective collapse process, but obviously it's a distinct physical theory from quantum mechanics, and it's yet to have experimental evidence for it. Bohmian mechanics, I find it to have really pleasing sort of intuitive aspect to it, but the difficulty comes when you
it doesn't match with, it doesn't really fit. Well, right. It doesn't fit with special relativity. So I think,
and it's sort of like ontological primitives in some sense are different from what contemporary physics is positing. So contemporary physics is talking about field theories, and it's not clear how Bohmian mechanics can be formulated in that fashion. I haven't seen the successful formulation of something.
So you would actually, right? So you would actually agree that Bohemian mechanics doesn't work. Like for the most part, it seems to be like very ad hoc, right?
I think it works for giving an intuitive picture of what might be underlying things like the double slit experiment. But I don't think it's right. I think it's going to turn out to not work. Well, I mean, I think that in some respects it's already having difficulties with contemporary physics. I mean, one of the virtues of many worlds is that, like, within cosmology, most people in cosmology take this approach to quantum mechanics, because it's very difficult when you're talking about like the global ontology of the world to, take some well, anyway, to do the calculations and get models, you kind of like can't arbitrarily pick out particular states of the wave function as being real. Anyway, that's a digression. So my difficulty with like models that involve consciousness is that there are precise questions that can be formulated, targeted towards them, that these models can't answer, and ultimately that's because they're not precise models. So they don't have any precise model about what constitutes consciousness, in the sense that what has the sufficient properties to cause collapse. They don't make any. And when I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about it from a hand-wavy sort of philosophy perspective. I mean, that's actually a pejorative. I shouldn't say.
I mean,
but I'm talking about it from the perspective of like an actual physical model. There is a physical model that explains why one state over another is picked out as being real, and there isn't a physical model that explains what type of physical system constitutes a conscious system sufficient to cause collapse.
Well, I think it's because, you would say that consciousness is not physical, so it can't be described in equations, right? I mean, that's kind of like what people like me would propose. I mean, that's the point. Yeah, I mean, so it seems like you're...
My difficulty with that is that I don't think that constitutes an explanation.
So you don't think it's... Okay. So basically...
I think when people make that move, I think that they've chosen not to engage in what I think. I mean, this is just my judgment, my epistemology. But,
that's why...
hold on, just let me get the thought. Go ahead. I don't think that form of explanation constrains anticipations of experience. So I think that it's merely like a curiosity stopper in my mind. Like, it hasn't gone to... It's effectively just given a label to something that isn't understood, and then said, we're not going to explain it further using like actual concrete models. And maybe that's okay. I mean, I don't really buy into that sort of thing. I think it's it goes back to what I was saying before. It fails to constrain experience. There's no prediction from it you can make. because it's not an actual model. It doesn't predict the phenomena. It just sort of gives a label to it.
All right. Well, I mean, I think people like me would just say that it's, it's non-physical, it's fundamental to reality. We're not saying that it's a physical system, right? Because consciousness is not a physical thing. It's the foundation of reality itself. So it doesn't need the sort of equations that other things, like physical things, would actually need. So, I mean, that's kind of my point of view.
If I ask you a question, so say, for example, if we take the model that I was presenting before about an electron, that it's in a superposition of being up and down, and we talk about our experience of that in observing one outcome over another, for you, what about your model explains why position or spin up versus spin down, or spin down versus spin up, is observed over the other one?
Well, for that, I would recommend there's a paper by Henry Stapp. It's called Attention, Intention, and Will. I don't know the exact, in quantum physics, I don't know the exact title because I haven't read it. It's been a while since I've read it. But he gives sort of an explanation of how, the brain and the mind will kind of interact and cause, conscious quantum collapse and stuff like that. I'll send you the link in Facebook. So, because I haven't read it, so
why?
I can't.
What's your explanation?
Well, basically, my explanation, I mean, if I'm going to put it in simple terms, the consciousness causes collapse.
Because I have an explanation.
Okay. So basically, what happens is our non-physical mind will interact with the non-physical world or quantum information, and then that'll create what's called the physical world, which is our perceptions. That's basically it. So it's an interaction with our non-mental mind. No, not sorry. I said that wrong. Non-physical mind, and then the non-physical reality of quantum information will interact to create our perceptions of the physical world. So that would be kind of my view.
Maybe the best thing to do is to ask questions about it. So how does that explain it?
No, because it's just in our perceptions, right? So we don't perceive we don't perceive quantum information in terms of things being in superposition, precisely because it's the interaction between our conscious minds and the conscious minds. And again, you can go back to Henry Stapp's paper. So basically, nature gives back a Dirac choice that we don't choose. It's just, because again, it's objective to us, right? So nature will give us a Dirac choice. I think this is how he says it, and then we respond with a
what choice?
A Dirac choice, and then we respond with a Heisenberg choice, essentially. So that's kind of, again, that's
what's a Dirac choice?
Again, you have to read. That's kind of the language that Henry Stapp uses, and then Inspired Philosophy also uses it in his video called The Measurement Problem. So he kind of explains it a little more there. But I'll send you the paper by Henry Stapp, and he kind of gets into how all that works. I don't like to, for me personally, since I'm more the philosophy guy, I don't really get into the physics aspects of it. But if you want to read the physics aspect of it, I'll send you that paper.
What I'm concerned about for you is when you think that it's explained. Like if you think that this is doing some explanation, and I inquire as to how. How does a direct, or what is a Dirac choice, and how does a Dirac choice explain why we observe one component of the superposition over another?
Well, it's because it's basically what nature gives us, essentially. So it's just what nature gives us because it's objective, and then we respond with the Heisenberg choice. And again, I'm gonna have to.
If I said that, like, so for example, if we just remove all of those words and then we talk about the spin, and then you ask me, oh, well, what explains why we observe spin up versus spin down? And if I just said to you, oh, it's just what nature gives us, would you think that was an explanation?
Well, no, because I can't tell you directly right now because I haven't read the paper in a while. So
Okay. Well, I
yeah,
mean, that's
yeah.
fair enough. I
No,
understand
yeah,
if
because
you.
I wasn't expecting you to ask me specifically how exactly it works because there's other physicists like Henry Stapp that I mentioned that kind of explain how that works. And again, I'll have to read his paper, and so I'll send you the paper. He kind of explains it, but basically he makes a distinction between the Heisenberg choice and the Dirac choice, and the Heisenberg choice is what nature gives us, and then we respond with a direct choice. And again, you can read his paper. He kind of gets into the details of how all that works, but yeah, that's
Right.
kind of the
This,
explanation he gives.
I
So
think that this is really similar to like a question following David Chalmers that I had about your version of cosmic idealism. How do you solve the subject constitution problem? That is, how do you, when faced with the metaphysical possibility that there would be no subjects distinct from God, constituted within the cosmic mind, how, like, how are subjects constituted within the cosmic mind? Like,
oh
are they emergent?
you're asking me?
Like,
Oh,
yeah,
sorry. For me, I would say that smaller minds like us were disassociated alters of universal consciousness. So we would still be supervenient in the sense that we would depend on the cosmic mind, but we would
right. So
not.
what I'm asking is like, how does that how does that work?
It's the
Like
same.
when you say that we are disassociated alters, um, so you're giving there, I think, some informal description of how subjects are constituted in the cosmic mind. What I'm curious about is how.
It's the same way that people with dissociative identity disorder would like basically cut off. It would take the larger consciousness and then cut off within that system essentially. So it's basically like disassociations will localize themselves um, into the universe essentially. So again, disassociation entails that it's localized in some sense and that it appeared later in the timeline. But yeah, that's basically how it works. Again, to the details, you would have to
Do you,
look at
do you
the
feel like
studies.
that's an sorry, I'm not I am sorry if this is getting rude, but do you feel like that's an explanation of how?
Well, yeah, because I don't have to explain how physics can produce consciousness. I just say that consciousness is fundamental, and then we're kind of disassociated alters from that universal mind, so to speak. In the same way of how our
Right.
dream characters at night would be disassociated alters from ourselves. How that exactly works, I don't really know. Again, there's a lot of neuroscience that goes into that, but yeah.
So I think that my difficulty in following these perspectives is that like I'm seeking an explanation, and I'm getting a description, but I don't think I'm getting an explanation. And one of the worries that I have is that one of the appeals of idealism is that it's meant to be an ontologically simpler model because it has consciousness as something that's a primitive and it's fundamental in the ontology. And when we take a cosmic mind perspective, um, I think that we have some explanatory work to do for that accounts for how it is that subjects such as humans or subjects such as frogs are disassociated alters from the conscious mind, and how they are associated in such a way that they have conscious experience, and how the varieties of their conscious experience arise from, or like what distinguishes their varieties of conscious experience. And I don't think that there's really an explanation there from what I've read of Kastrop, and I think like Chalmers, for example, I think he points out that there's a good research program here in metaphysics, but I think that there are still significant open problems. And I think that the open problems that remain bear on this claim that ontologically there is something superior about putting consciousness as a fundamental to begin with, because there, I think, are still open descriptions and additions to the ontology that explain why it is that these macroscopic subjects, such as ourselves, become disassociated from the cosmic mind. Because to me, at least from a conceivability perspective, metaphysically, it's conceivable that that there is no disassociation. It's conceivable that all there is a conscious mind, and that no disassociation occurs. And so I think that we are in need of giving an explanation for how that process occurs, why that process occurs, and how it actually produces the phenomenology of our experience. And so just in the same manner that, like, on a critique of some kind of physicalist thesis, we want to demand how it is that, for example, the hard problem is resolved, how it is that the phenomenology of our experience is explained in terms of purely physical primitives. I think the same types of problems are going to apply, and same needs for explanation are going to apply to a form of idealism like Bernardo's.
Well, right. I mean, I have looked into what's called a decombination problem, and that's kind of where people will there's a lot of philosophers that kind of present that argument against cosmopsychism, for example. And again, I think Bernardo does acknowledge that, at least in, he's mentioned the fact that, yes, it's true that under his model, at least particularly, you don't necessarily need disassociated alters, right? And that's why I kind of differ with him in the sense that I do think that the universal consciousness has awareness, like it's a God, right? So it will produce other minds from itself, essentially. So it'll use its own mental states to kind of create alters intentionally, so that then you will have alters, and that kind of explains why humans exist, for example. Because under naturalism, you can't really, there wouldn't be a prediction. Like, yeah, naturalism could explain why humans exist, but it doesn't make that prediction in the same sort of way. Whereas something like my
so
idealism.
Are you worried there? You worried there with that, or are you?
No, yeah, I'm worried about Kastrop's view specifically.
Yeah. I guess that, like, to frame my concern about that and to try to draw back to that thread that I gave before, I think that you're actually adding quite a bit more to your ontology by positing such things than merely that consciousness is a primitive. And so now, when we thought, for example, that there might be some explanatory or theoretical virtue behind a metaphysics where consciousness is a primitive, I now start to have the worry that with this addition of more and more things to give us our, explanation of disassociated alters, that maybe we're just, rehearsing the same kind of criticism of physicalism that really, like, we're not giving ourselves anything better by doing this.
Well, I mean, under naturalism, you wouldn't really predict that humans exist. So whereas under, theism, you actually would predict that humans exist, and they do exist. So, I mean, it depends on how you approach it. Like, because I know Richard...
That goes back to... hold on, though. I thought that we agreed at the beginning of the conversation that theism is a broad hypothesis space.
No, right. Well, that's why. No, I agree with that. Yeah, I'm just saying, like, specifically, a theism that's more compatible with Christian theism would predict that humans, that conscious minds other than God exist, right? Because if God's loving, then he's going to create other beings. And the mechanism by which he does that, under my view, would be disassociation. So,
right. But what I see that's occurred there is that you've posited a highly specific form of theism that's specifically tailored to give an expectation. And I think that what you're not doing is accounting for how, by choosing a very narrow region of the hypothesis space, how that affects the prior probability of your theory. So on one hand, you're trying to make the claim that your theory, on the one hand, you're trying to make the claim that your theory, by virtue of having consciousness as fundamental, gives you some explanatory virtue because of the fact that consciousness would be, fundamental. So
right.
But then on the other hand, you're saying that the only way that we get there to explain human experience is by, within a theistic hypothesis, choose a very, very narrow region of the hypothesis space. And that's where I think that we have difficulty, because I can select a really narrow region of the hypothesis space too. I can say that the original vector of the Hilbert space of our universe was one that had precisely the necessary description to lead to to deterministically evolve into a world that had a planet going around a sun, which eventually evolved via natural selection, humans that have consciousness. Like, anybody can do that. Like, I can do that too. I can choose like a tiny region of the hypothesis space too, and just say that, like, well, that's my explanation. But I don't feel like we get anywhere by doing that. Like, that's
well,
I mean,
are you saying, because under that model, it seemed like nature would be like it would have some sort of purpose rather than just being random, right?
No, it just happened to be in a configuration that would lead to human minds under its deterministic evolution.
No, right, but if it's deterministic, it would have to be like teleological in some sense, right?
I don't think so. I think that it just happens to. I think it would just happen to. It would just need to be in a particular state that would lead to us under the causal determinism. But it's almost 2 hours.
No, I know. I was about to say, like, I gotta go, but it was nice fun, talking to you. Yeah, I mean, obviously,
I really appreciate your perspective, and if I'm in any way beating up on it, I only do that because I'm interested in this stuff too. And this whole process of trying to figure out what's true in the world is a passion of mine, as well as it clearly is yours.
Right.
And so I consider you and Michael, even though I have criticisms of him, and Josh Rasmussen and Johannes Ratz and Kastrop and Henry Stapp and all these people, I consider you all comrades in this
in the search of truth,
of figuring out what's true. And so I won't be. I like you for it, and I appreciate that.
No, right. I do. Yeah, I like atheists like you that kind of will dialogue and not, because my last conversation with Tom Jump was not very good. He just kept saying I was wrong, whereas you seem to be way more open-minded than he was. So I do appreciate, the dialogue and conversation. So.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your views, and I love the fact that you like in this project with me of trying to figure out what the heck's going on.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're gonna end the broadcast now. Thank you guys for watching. So.
See everyone.
Yep.